Hello and welcome to the webinar on the Digital Green Certificate co-hosted by Euroconsumers and the Good Lobby. My name is Alberto Alemanno. I'm a professor of European law at HEC in Paris and the founder of the Good Lobby. Today's webinar will provide you with a state of play of the adoption of the Digital Green Certificate that was proposed by the European Commission and is planned to be adopted by the co-legislators by June of this year. To do so, we have lined up a stellar panel of speakers. We have Juan Fernando López Aguilar, member of the European Parliament, chair of the Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs, the LIBE Committee, and rapporteur on the Digital Green Certificate. We also have Professor Luisa Bielaziewicz from the University of Amsterdam, who has been writing extensively on the issue, Luis Araújo, president of Turismo Portugal, the Portuguese tourism agency, and Julie Frère, spokesperson for Testachat, the Belgian member of Euroconsumers, as well as Ileana Itzverniațianu, spokesperson of OCU, the Spanish member of Euroconsumer. Before getting the conversation started, I would like to set the scene by sharing a few figures coming from a recent survey that was conducted by Euroconsumers, in which give us a sense of not only the appetite that there is in Europe for the introduction of such a certificate, but also the overall expectations and conditions, I would say, around the welcoming of this new measure. So as you know, the question we would like to address with all of you is how can the Digital Green Certificate somehow lead to a fair and effective system for citizens to regain the right to travel in Europe. So the big question obviously now is what a certificate is, and the EU interpretation of a COVID certificate is particularly comprehensive because it includes not only a vaccination certification, but also a test and an immunization one. The idea is very much about giving special rights, granting a waiver from the existing restrictions that virtually all 27 countries have introduced, while allowing each country to determine the access to the vaccination, to the test, and to the immunization. So rather than a full harmonization on these different kind of documents, we're really talking about the system ensuring their interoperability. That's what the certificate is really about. When you look at the survey, you clearly see that there is a majority of European citizens who see value in the Digital Green Certificate because they immediately link it to the possibility to exercise the right of free movement. But there's also an expectation, actually higher than that, that the component of the certificate linked to testing should be conditioned upon the gratuity of the test that countries at the moment are charging for, with a few exceptions like France. There's also a further request, which is really important in the overall economy of the proposal put forward by the Commission, which is to deny the possibility of the member states, once the COVID certificate is adopted, to introduce extra restrictions on top of the requirement of the COVID certificate. Example could be to undergo extra PCR test, which is the case at the moment, or quarantine measures on top of the vaccination document, the immunization, or the test. And if you look at the current political debate, and we're going to hear more from López Aguilar, our member of the European Parliament today, really much focused on two major political requests that the European Parliament made to the European Commission and the Council, meaning gratuity of tests and at the same time denying the possibility for the member states to introduce further measure. At the end of the day, should member states be allowed to do so, this would defy the rationale for the proposal because the certificate would not create any added value because at the end of the day, the member states will still be possible, will still have the possibility to create further restrictions. It is against this backdrop today that we would like to hear a little bit what is the state of play in the current negotiations, what is in particular the position that the different member states do have.
For us, the important situation, and after such a difficult year where the tourism sector has been one of the most hardly hit by this pandemic, is to recover mobility. It's a time of moving, it's a time to move. And the only way we will restore mobility is if we change the perception of a risk country to a risky person. That is why we advocate so heavily for this digital green pass, as well as for the elimination of other barriers to mobility. If we consider not a risky country, but we consider means of evaluating if a person is a risky person or not, then there is no need for quarantines or any other restrictions in our countries. This said, we congratulate the Commission, especially on how quick they were in terms of approval and proposal to the Parliament. And we think this is the time for all the countries, and we know that all the countries are looking at this as a window of hope in terms of restoring this mobility between countries. We also think that it's crucial, together with this, for countries to elaborate a little bit more on how to become more competitive in terms of stimulating trust between consumers. And this trust is restored if you have on place and at easy hands ways to do the testing. If we find and if we accept that antigen tests are as efficient as PCR tests, which are much more expensive than the antigen tests, and most important, that we accept and realize nationally and internationally that this is the only way we will restore our economies and our mobility. And I think that the digital pass it's not the only solution, but it's a very big step towards a coordinated approach, which we have been demanding from the European Union and from many countries, in order to, of course, keep the same path of controlling the spreading of the disease, but releasing so many restrictions that we now have. And I think that when we consider the rights of the consumers, that is our first right, our right to move from one place to the other. If we consider that, then the rest will come. I think we have to take measures in order to implement situations or more efficiency in this control in each nation, giving access to tests, accepting antigen tests and not PCR, giving more information and getting more data on how this spreading goes with the mobility. And only then think about if these tests have to be free, and I think they will have to be free for those who want to travel, because it's the only way we also don't discriminate consumers when they want to travel and where they want to go.
Let me ask an initial question to set the scene about the pros and the cons of a document like the proposed COVID certificate by turning to Professor Luisa Bialasiewicz, who has been thinking and writing about this issue. If you can give us, Luisa, in a couple of minutes, really the major pros and cons of this kind of health documents that Europe has never actually been granting in the past. So this is something new for the EU to do. Luisa.
Thank you very much. I think, this is both a challenge, but could be also an opportunity. I mean, if we think from a governance perspective of the ability to provide this sort of health certificate, the challenge is unfortunately at this point still risk outweighing the benefits, precisely because there is no full coordination. There isn't this kind of interoperability that you're talking about. And I think the great issue is that there are great differences between member states, but also within them in access to vaccinations. You've already noted very differential access to testing, whether it is free testing or not, but also actually access to this sort of testing, and the possibility to even issue these certificates. So I think, again, from a governance perspective, there's the issue of citizens' equal rights, but also, a very kind of unequal geography of both access, but also the ability to make these certificates work. And I think one concern that I have is the fact that countries, but also regions, have been rushing to create their own certificates. And so I think a very strong, kind of hand at the, European level is needed to make this work. I'll stop here because, I'm sure there will be other points that colleagues will make, and I'm happy to come back to several of these.
Thank you, Louisa. Absolutely. The overall feeling we have is that the EU feel compelled to step in because the member states are introducing their own certificates. And this would clearly entail, at the end of the day, a major patchwork that would make free movement virtually impossible. And the EU feel compelled to step in to ensure this interoperability. But all this is happening in a very rush manner without an impact assessment on the proposal, without a thoughtful process that might potentially address some of the flaws that you have highlighted. I'm very curious to hear now from our consumer representatives to see what they think on some of the issues that Louisa pinpointed to. Perhaps if we can ask Julie first, what's her take on this idea, because it's a proposal, but it remains an idea. It hasn't been adopted and there's some margin for improvement there. Julie.
Thank you, Alberto, for giving me the word. First of all, I would like to say that as part of Euroconsumers, the Stasha is really happy with the fact that the Commission is at least trying to coordinate something. I think we definitely need coordination in the framework of this pandemic. We've seen it for vaccination. We see it now with this certificate. Of course, there are some things that need to be going better for the future, but this is also the first time that the Commission is confronted and the EU institution more broadly confronted to such a problematic. And so we are very in favor of this European coordination. And I can give you a very concrete example of passengers that contacted us 2 days ago wanting to go to Portugal. They had booked a flight. They needed to show the proof of a negative PCR test. They had done so, they had their document, and they could not get in the plane. Why? Because Portugal asks for an RT-PCR negative test. They only had a negative PCR test. Actually, it's exactly the same test, but the name is different. So these people had their negative test, could not get on board. And I have to add that above all of this, they had to pay for these PCR tests. So this is a very concrete example, in my opinion, of a lack of coordination between member states that is going to be a real obstacle for traveling. And we know that after more than 1 year, people are really looking forward to travel again. Another small example, if you take Portugal, you see that you need to have a PCR test as from 2 years old, 24 months. If you look at Spain, it's 6 years old. So all these different criteria are very a mess for the consumer wanting to travel. So I agree with what Professor Bielasevic said saying that there are real challenges that need to be addressed. But I think it's an ongoing process and that's going into the right direction, and that this tool could ultimately be very efficient for consumers to be able to travel again.
Thank you, Julie, for providing us some concrete examples of the current situation on the ground. As a consumer organization, you hear a lot of stories that really come from the realities of people crossing borders. And I think your first illustration really shows the limits of the current situation, but also of partly of the current proposal, because at the end of the day, the member states will still be free to set up different criteria in order to obtain that particular certificate. So this is not harmonization. We are not harmonizing the criteria. We're just harmonizing the document that will allow people. So some of the semantics, some of the bureaucratic struggles might be overcome, but there might still be some challenges ahead. Ileana, what is your perspective from OCU and from your own realities, what you hear, what your work is actually showing you in relation to the case for such a certificate?
Thank you, Alberto, for inviting me, and thank you, Euroconsumer and Good Lobby, of course. I'm very happy, as Julie said, because we think the Commission and the Parliament are going ahead. So from our perspective, a Spanish perspective, and according to the survey conducted by a Spanish consumer organization together with Euroconsumer, 61% of consumers are in favor of digital green certificate as a way of recovering freedom of movement all around Europe. But it's true that citizens are worried about this passport could discriminate between people have been vaccinated or not. This is the key point for us. So taking into account this message and this point of view, if we can ensure that digital green certificate is well received by Spanish citizens, Europe and all the member states will have to take into account this relevant and key point. Pandemic fatigue is a fact in Spain, in our country. Spanish citizens wish to leave this nightmare behind and recover all their fundamental rights, and a real reality, not a false or a fake reality. And the digital green certificate will help, but governments can be mistaken tabling discriminatory, disproportionate, or in coordination measures if they want to success. Spain, as you know, is a special case because tourism sector represents around the 40.6% of its GDP, including bar, restaurants, and connected industries. And there are 2.8 million people working in this sector. So it's very, very relevant for us. So in our case, as a host country, we do need a real non-discrimination digital green certificate to recover a Spanish economy. And we need that the digital green certificate paves the way for free and safe movement, but avoiding, this is key also, unequal restrictions of the freedom of movement of those who have not been vaccinated, for instance. Having said that, European governments, in our opinion, have to ensure easy and free access to testing for all citizens. I would like to insist in free tests, since currently the average cost of PCR in Spain is between 115 and 180 euros. It is totally unaffordable for instance, for a 4-member family. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ileana, for providing the consumer's perspective and building on what Julie already said. I see Mr. Lopez Aguilar, chair of the LIBE committee and rapporteur of this file, joining us. So I would like to ask him, what is the state of play of the current negotiations, notably in relation to the member states' position and in relation to the demands put forward by the parliament, such as the gratuity of the PCR testing? Do you think that this proposal has some chances to pass through the Parliament and the Council? Please, Mr. Lopez Aguilar, and thank you for joining us today.
First of all, good morning. The pleasure is all mine. I thank you for having me and giving me the chance to exchange some views and share concerns, because the concerns that I have just heard of are my concerns, are the concerns of the European Parliament, and are expressed in the mandate of negotiation that was voted largely by a wide majority in the last plenary in April. And that mandate of negotiation means that we are bound as negotiating team, me as rapporteur, and the shadow rapporteurs, which are the coordinators of every political group, before the Council in the so-called interinstitutional negotiation we used to call trialogues in the European jargon. Those concerns are our concerns. Yes, we are worried about Schengen eroded. we are worried about free movement suspended. We are well aware that free movement is by far the most valuable asset of the European experience ever. If there is a fundamental right that the European citizens stick to, is precisely that, free movement, and it's been suspended because of an accumulation of emergency measures, quote unquote, that have been taken unilaterally by member states, at times grossly in violations of the Schengen Borders Code, in violations of European law. Besides, there have been so many fundamental rights affected according to the constitutional architectures of the relevant member states. We care about that. We have adopted a number of resolutions. But yes, we have stirred up the Commission to take initiative to restore Schengen, to relaunch free movement. And the Commission has come up with this idea, a certificate that would be unitary, homogeneous, and valid in all of the member states, so that those citizens which are bearing that certificate, which would be granted automatically, would be given access to free movement back again, to cross-border visiting, working, tourism, if that might be the case. But yes, there are a number of considerations that we have made clearly. Not only the certificates are to be free of charge, of course, the Commission has to tackle the discriminatory range of economic cost of the test itself. Yes, it has been said in Spain is prohibitive, absolutely prohibitive. I'm talking to you from the Canaries. Every time I have to fly back and forth, I have to take 2 or 3 PCRs a week. I am to be refunded by the European Parliament, but is that the case of a student? Is that the case of a worker? Do we have to pay private labs and private clinics 180 euros every time we take a flight? I have put this example more than once. In the Canaries, we have a subsidy by the Ministry of Transportation in Spain, according to the Canarian fiscal regime, which subsidizes much of the price of the airfare for the Canarian residents. It is often the case that the PCR is more costly than the airfare itself. So it's prohibitive. That this has to be tackled. There has to be a public pricing policy adopted by the European Union at the European level, so that we tackle the issue of prohibitory prices of the PCR. They have to be free of charge or covered by the European budgeting or the member states budgeting. Then, of course, for them not to be discriminatory, there has to be an array of choices, not only vaccination, but also immunology test, the so-called serological test, to prove that you are immune because you have overcome the COVID infection and you happen to be immune. Yes, there are scientific doubts as to how long will it take, how long will it last, but it is not for the European Parliament to give scientific responses. It's to take legislative measures in order to handle a situation which requires urgently something be done to restore Schengen and to relaunch free movement. And that take relaunching mutual trust between member states and mutual trust between citizens, trust between citizens, so that they can dare to somehow book again in the internet an airfare, a package to fly in holidays or to take some week off with the family, with the reassurance, with the guarantee that they are not to be imposed upon discriminatory measures, restrictive measures. So another issue that we have put on the table is that member states should refrain to adopt additional restrictive measures once the certificate is enforced. Once the certificate is effective, there should be no place for additional restrictive measures, because otherwise people would think, what's the point? Then what's the use of it? Why did it take the bother to adopt this piece of legislation through an urgent procedure? You ask for the state of the play. We are negotiating round the clock. Every day there is a technical meeting, and every other day a trialogue. Just yesterday we had again a discussion with the Council and with the Commission as an honest broker to try to get closer. The member states are somehow sticking to the principle that they are sovereign to impose additional measures. But then our representation of the European citizens' concern goes, then what's the point Why did you want it? Why did you want this certificate in the first place if you are to adopt restrictive measures to those ones bearing the certificate? The certificate has to be granted automatically. And of course, consistency with fundamental rights, and particularly with data protection, because European data protection law happens to be the highest standard in the world for good reason. And we wanted to keep it that way. That means purpose limitation. It means that those data which are contained in the certificate are to be minimalized. And second, they are to be useful only for the purpose of cross-border transit within the area of liberty, justice, and security, which means the Schengen space within the European Union with no internal borders. They shouldn't be used for no other purposes, let alone say going to a restaurant, public places, theaters, or gyms. They should not be used for internal purposes or for policing the population, for policing the European movement within the area of Schengen. With those points being made, we want a piece of legislation which is restrained to the purpose limitation, which is useful so that people would know that we are caring about doing something about relaunching Schengen and free movement, which is essential in many ways. And we want also to be time framed. That's why we have imposed a so-called sunset clause. It should last 1 year. And before the end of the year, 3 months in advance, excuse me, the Commission should have to report as to the implementation of the certificate. So we can see how it goes. As I said, the certificate is to be valid on paper or digital format with 3 choices: vaccination, serological test, immunity, but also PCR, which is the kind of nightmare that we've been having so far for 1 year now. I mean, every time you take a flight, you may always have the choice of a PCR, of a negative PCR. So if you have not been vaccinated, you can also have your certificate on the grounds of a negative PCR, so that you're giving access. So the certificate will say that you have been vaccinated according to a vaccine that has been acknowledged by the agency, by the European agency, that you have recovered from the infection through a so-called serological test, or you are holder of a negative PCR, which gives you way. So you should be refrained from quarantines, isolation periods, or arbitrary measures, which mostly are discriminatory in its very shape, making the difference between different categories of European citizens on the grounds of a so-called dangerous profiling, infection profiling, which in our view is extremely detrimental to the recovery of trust, which is the premise, which is the underlying principle, which is the underlying ground of this operation of relaunching Schengen as the most valuable asset of the European experience and the most appreciated fundamental right by the European citizens by large. That would be my summary of the situation.
Thank you, Mr. Lopez Aguilar, for providing us a very comprehensive analysis showing awareness from the Parliament side of the possible flaws or limitations of this system. But ultimately, the success of this certificate, once adopted, will depend on the member states' willingness and political commitment to abide by it. Yet, despite the Commission's best efforts to create some forms of coordination among member states up to now, this hasn't really happened. Why this time should be different?
Well, that is a fair question, but we can actually bounce back that question to the Council. If you're actually concerned about the terrible social and economic impact of all those emergency measures that have been taken, of this suspension of Schengen and free movement, if you're really worried about the crumbling down of the incomes and the economic input of tourism, for one thing, in the GDP, which is the case of many member states of the European Union, including mine, Spain. In Spain, tourism amounts to 12% of the GDP, let alone say the Canaries. I'm a Canarian myself, and in the Canaries, it's 36% of the GDP, 45% of employment. So the social and economic impact of these measures that have put Schengen in suspension, not only at stake in suspension, and free movement to a halt, has been a catastrophe. So if you're really worried about overcoming this situation in which out of panic, there's only confusion and legal uncertainty, okay, then be consistent with the idea. So be consistent with the idea that a certificate would do the trick, at least for 1 year. And let's see how the vaccination process, let's see how the immunity process, the so-called herd immunity process underway is unfolding and somehow changing this situation, which is untenable. Of course, the pandemic fatigue, we should bear it in mind. The European citizens are going sick and tired of all this confusion and legal uncertainty. Nobody wants to book an airfare ticket or to book a week of holidays with family if we are risking to be isolated, marooned in some room of a hotel arbitrarily for no reason. So if there is a certificate, that should do the trick. If you don't want that trick, then don't give us the bother to negotiate in a hastily fashion, round the clock, every day, a round of negotiations with the council, and then technical meetings, and then trying to amend in the most perfect way this piece of legislation, which should be, as I said, not only purpose limitation, time framed, but also somehow put to the test of its effectiveness. Let's see how it works. Let's see if it does the trick. That is my reasoning to the council. If they don't want it, then why should we bother? If they're willing to keep the things as they are and the reins at their hand, then why do we bother in legislating in an urgent procedure, which is of course extremely uncomfortable for the negotiating team of the European Parliament? Why should we?
Right. I think this is the question to be put to the council. What would be the added value of this certificate if then would not be respected? Let me give the chance to our consumer representative here, perhaps Julie Frère, to ask something to Mr. Lopez Aguilar, something you would expect to happen in addition to all the concerns he already expressed and acknowledged himself. Julie.
Well, that's a difficult question, Alberto, because I think Sir Lopez Aguilar already raised lots of the issues that we actually raised ourselves. Testasha was published a position paper at the beginning of March, raising all the concerns that were right now answered by Sir Lopez Aguilar, definitely about the risk of discrimination between vaccinated and unvaccinated people if free PCR tests were not provided. So we are aware of the fact, and you mentioned it as well, Alberto, that the importance of the willingness to work from the member states, because it's easy it's something that we see happening quite frequently. It's the EU institutions' fault. It's the EU's fault, and then we see the member states blocking on some tools that could have been efficient if they would have worked on it. Also accepting to lose, in a way, some of their national competences or to share their national competences on these topics. For me, the really most important point is definitely these PCR tests. And as I also heard the purpose limitation and the time limitation, we've heard that after 1 year, the tool would end. In my opinion, it should end even before, if it's not justified at this time. There is, for me, an ongoing assessment of this tool that has to occur, because, as we said, it is a limitation to we have now limitations to our rights to move. But this tool is also, even if it's trying, of course, to facilitate movement, it can also be an obstacle to movement if it's used well, while it should not. I mean, if the health situation does not require it anymore, or if its purpose is not there anymore. So I think Mr. Lopez Aguilar raised the main points for us. So we really hope, from our perspective, that we will obtain PCR free tests, and also real coordination, a summer plan. That's also what we've asked, a real summer plan. What is going to happen this summer for consumer? What if the health situation changes? we have been confronted to so many questions from consumers. They are asking us almost every day, is it the right time to travel? Should I book my holidays now? What are the risks if I book my holidays now? And it's actually very difficult for us to answer properly. So we are really in favor of this tool, but as you also raised, Alberto, if this tool is only, if member states add additional requirements to this tool and that it only become really an administrative, really burdensome tool for consumers, then I think it's also a real risk for the European Commission to almost be ridiculous. I know that this term is quite strong, but I mean, it's a real challenge now to see that, to show, that this tool is efficient, is useful, and that it's going to facilitate people's life and not make their lives more complicated. That's definitely
Thank you.
Not what we would like.
Thank you, Julie. So Julie Freire, if I have to sum up for Mr. Aguilar, is really concerned that this certificate might become a precondition to exercise the right of free movement. And as such, it might actually be incompatible with European law. So in a way, the EU is crystallizing a breach of European law by adopting such a certificate. Are there legal analyses from the legal parliament or the legal services of the parliament or other institutions that actually address those concerns, Mr. Aguilar?
The short answer should be yes, by all means. You have mentioned a variety of technical points, but behind all the technical points that are to be made and cleared out, there is a matter of principle, a political principle. The European experience has been a story of success, let's put it this way, in a conventional rhetoric, in a conventional literature on the matter, because it's been written by law. It's been made by law. It's about law. So it means that member states should understand that free movement within the Schengen area is no longer the sole competence, the realm of the member states. It is ruled by European law, legislated law. I at times hear about Schengen Convention. Schengen is not a convention. Schengen is a regulation. There is a Schengen Borders Code, as there is a visa code, which is made by European piece of legislation, which is binding for the member states, and citizens are entitled to claim its respect before the courts of justice, all the way to the European Court of Justice itself to condemn the country which is in defiance or in violation of those principles of law. And it's absolutely unbearable that this COVID situation, which is absolutely unexpected and unprecedented, has given way to a situation in which there is an absolute legal uncertainty, where there have been an accumulation of gross violations of European law. We have to put to a halt this situation, which is untenable for the prestige, for the credibility of the European Union itself. I mean, you cannot ask the European citizens to respect the European law, to respect the European Union itself, if member states do not abide by the law. So we have to give credit to a piece of legislation which is meant to be a regulation. And that regulation should do the trick. Yes, there is much concern all across the member states. I mean, I am a frequent interlocutor of the business sector in the Canaries. So tourist industry, hotel owners, restaurants, service providers, and all the services which are around the insum of 18 million people coming to the Canaries a year, which all of a sudden ceased to come, stopped from coming, are asking for a response. Do something, do something, do something. Some kind of a passport, some kind of a credit, some kind of a title, some kind of a certificate that somehow invites people to regain confidence, that they can dare again to book a flight, that they can dare again to come over, that they can dare again to cross borders, that they can dare again. Yes, free movement theoretically is still there, so you can always try, but if you try, then you have to undergo the consequences which have to be imposed unilaterally by member states in defiance of European law. For instance, you have to be in your room hotel for 15 days. What? that has been happening for so long. And more than that, in every member state, there have been constitutional crises because of the pandemic. in every member state, there have been challenges to the constitutional architecture, let alone saying in Spain. In Spain, we have seen free movement within Spain suspended, the so-called perimetral confinement between regions. We have seen measures making a negative impact on fundamental rights adopted by municipalities or regions. Nothing of the kind had never happened. That's not the constitution, but that is happening. So we need somehow to reshape, to put ourselves together and try to come up with a response which makes sense. In my way, the European Parliament's mandate makes sense at a European level. It makes sense. I think it has been positively assessed by the European public opinion in all and by the public opinion in the member states. I say, listen, well, it makes sense. It's time framed. Let's give it a try. It is to be covering an array of choices. It's not only vaccination, it can also be serological, it can also be PCR, but anyway, it's a unitary certificate. It's one certificate. It's not that we have to, as it is often the case. I mean, I'm a professional of the European institutions. I am an official of the European, I'm a member of parliament. And every time I fly, I am WhatsApping all around to get to know which are the certificates that I'm supposed to bear in this particular flight. The QR negative, the essential travel justification, the sworn declaration, the negative PCR, besides my boarding pass. It's kind of crazy. And besides the economic cost and the time cost of all this is refraining people to regain confidence in the European level. So behind all the technicalities which are to be discussed thoroughly in every negotiating round that we're having face-to-face with the Council in a tug of war, which is never easy, with the Council, before all these technical issues that we have to discuss, there is a political point here. If member states are to prolong this situation, they're on the verge of risking the prestige, the credibility, the link of affection between European citizens and the European experience. If you challenge free movement, then what's left? Then what's left? If you challenge free movement, then what's left of the European Union? Tell me, the euro, the central bank, the Brussels jargon, this is a huge challenge, an existential challenge for the European Union to restore free movement. The sooner the better. So this is my message to the Council, representing, I guess, your concerns.
Thank you. And as you said, the Schengen was already somehow questioned by many countries following the terrorist attacks, right? With France suspending, de facto introducing border checks. So COVID only accelerated and made worse a situation of lack or limited trust among member states of the Union when it comes to free movement.
Yeah, but if you allow me precisely, you're making a point here. There is the Schengen Borders Code, which allows, yes, Article 27 and 28 of the Schengen Borders Code allows precisely for emergency measures on security grounds. And it had always been the case that it was right after a terrorist attack. And you know what? The country which had suffered a terrorist attack had to communicate its intention to suspend temporarily Schengen, free movement. But by the same token, it had to put it to a time frame, maximum 10 days. And if it has to be renewed every 15 days, it has to be communicated and coordinated with all of the member states. This is not the way this panic has described in the reaction, in the adoption of the emergency measures. Besides, there is legal discussion. We have accepted it, but there is legal discussion that security grounds cover sanitary health public crisis, because security was always related to terrorist attack, not this public health condition. Yes, it's an emergency for sure. But the point is that if we are to suspend Schengen, we are to be well aware that it cannot go like this. It cannot last for years, and it cannot give way to a so-called action, reaction, retaliation, negative dynamic between member states. You suspend me, my citizens, your border with me, then I'm going to retaliate you. You are restoring the internal border between France and Spain, then I'm going to retaliate you. Right. That is extremely negative for the credibility of the European Union.
This logic of reciprocity is very foreigner to the European Union. It's really the antithesis of what mutual trust should entail. I'm very curious to hear from Professor Bielaziewicz now a reaction to Mr. Lopez Aguilar, a champion for European citizenship rights, a champion for European consumer in this particular situation. Which would be your question, Luisa, to Mr. Lopez Aguilar?
So first, thank you very much for the urgency with which you're presenting this and the need for strong and immediate response from the EU, because you're absolutely right. We need to rebuild credibility, we need to rebuild trust, and especially, go against this sort of arbitrary application that is profoundly unequal also between different locations and regions. And I'm very glad that you brought this up, because how is it possible that right now it is easier for some European citizens to travel abroad, to travel even to another member state, than it is to move within their own country? And people are very confused by this. But I wanted to ask you another question, because you're absolutely right. There is already, and there is the risk of a very unequal patchwork of additional measures. But I believe there may be also another risk of kind of local and regional inequality, because what we're seeing right now, without full coordination, without this certificate being rolled out, is a competition of localities to reopen, kind of creating their own forms of certification, competing against each other. And this, I think, is equally an issue. So, whether it's COVID-free bubbles like islands that are able to do this and claim, that they can offer safe environments, something that, a tourist city, for example, cannot. I think, this form of legislation regulation is also necessary to prevent this, kind of patchwork from developing of, kind of unequal, not just unequal limitations, but literally localities competing against each other. So I'll stop there.
You're right again, if I may say. You're right again. That is a serious risk, and precisely that is why we have to haste. We have to speed up in order to prevent that from happening, because it is about to happen. Yes, we have serious signals that not only member states, regions within member states are adopting their own certificates on the wrong grounds, on the wrong commitments, on the wrong purposes. That has to be prevented, because that would be not only a patchwork, that would be a chaos. That would be the denial of the European response, which is most needed. That is precisely, I think, we really have to haste, we have to speed up to come to a regulation, which I insist is a European piece of legislation, which is binding for the member states. Let's make no mistake, a regulation is a serious thing. A regulation is bound to be binding for the states according to the principles of primacy and direct effect, which is to be guaranteed by the European Court of Justice, ultimately. So that landscape that you have just suggested would be the ultimate denial of the European Union, a patchwork, a chaos, a labyrinth in which you're not only certain when crossing borders between member states as to which are the conditions, you're also somehow subject to the measures that have been imposed at the regional level, or regional certificates, or the requirements that are to be imposed by regional authorities in member states. That has to be prevented. And we have a chance. We have a chance if we make this piece of legislation a difference, if we make this piece of legislation effective. So if we let this piece of legislation, the certificate, the European COVID certificate, do the trick, so that the bearer of that certificate, which is granted automatically, free of charge, is given access to the territory of another member state, and by thus being exempt from additional restrictive measures, that would be a signal that we are trying to somehow be on the helm back again, be on the willing steer back again, instead of indulging into this agglomeration of contradictory measures, which would only nurture the negative dynamic that I described as to the action, reaction, retaliation sequence that we have seen so far, which is extremely, I say, extremely risky business for the European process, for the European ideal, for the European experience, and for the European idea.
A quick follow-up on this, because I think it's a very important conceptual point here. If the conditions of access to tests, to immunizations differ from one country to another, how can the certificate overcome the concerns that Luisa is putting to you? Because at the end of the day, each country will remain free to determine who gets the test, under which conditions, who is declared immune as opposed to another one. We're talking about interoperability. We're not talking about harmonization.
Precisely. And that is a very strong point, a technical point, which I escaped for the sake of being most effective in the summary of the political points of the negotiation. But yes, there is a technical point which is essential: interoperability. Again, so the Commission has to invest in helping out the member states to put in place the so-called critical infrastructures, the technological means, the logistic disposals, which may assure the interoperability of data. Because yes, there's a variety of vaccines. Insofar as they are acknowledged by the agency, it'll be fine. There is a slight variation in the so-called emergency list of the World Health Organization, WHO, which the member states are interested in getting also on board, not only the agency, but the emergency list of the World Health Organization. But then as to the serological test, yes, there might be some legitimate concerns or even doubts under the scientific point of view. But every time this issue comes up, my approach is always the same. The purpose of a piece of legislation adopted by the European Parliament as a lawmaking body is not sorting out scientific questions. At times I am asked in the discussion, and how do you know how long will the serological test will be valid? How do you know how long the immunity will be there? How do you know that how long will the vaccination give you the reassurance that you're not to be infected if you have been vaccinated? I say, hey, it's not for the legislator to come up with scientific answers. It's not for the legislator to clear the way for pharmacological investigation or research. That is another path that has to be fulfilled by the industry, by the science, and by the medical investigation. We can only come up with a piece of legislation with law in action. And law means that insofar as we are expecting or awaiting for some scientific or medical developments, which hopefully will change the situation for the better, we are putting in place for 1 year a certificate which will somehow regain trust that you may travel back again, that you may dare to fly again, that you may dare to take your car and go from Spain all the way to the Netherlands, all the way to Sweden, back again, like in the good old times, with one certificate. So let's hope it will work for 1 year, insofar as we are waiting for the developments. But yes, interoperability is a fact, and that has to be handled and tackled by the Commission, which is the one in charge. We have done that before. There is an interoperability package we adopted in the LIBE committee related to security matters, in order to connect ETIAS, ETRIS, SIS, VIS all together in large-scale intelligence management, for which we have an agency, the so-called EU LISA. So, I mean, interoperability has to be secured by the Commission. That is a technical issue, but I insist, we have to make a clear mind, to keep a clear mind, so that we do not trap ourselves into the scientific questions, which are legitimate, but not to be responded by the lawmaker, which is the European Parliament.
Thank you, Mr. Aguilar. Let me ask Ileana Itzvernicianu, spokesperson of OCU, Spanish member of Euroconsumers. Ileana, I'm sure you have something to ask to Mr. López Aguilar.
Yes, thank you, Alberto, and thank you, Mr. Lopez Aguilar, for his explanation, for his efforts, and for his job. I have a question from a lot of Spanish consumers, and I think Luisa took this question, but I have to insist on it. How Europe can explain why people from other countries can visit all the regions in Spain, and people from Spain who have houses on the beach, in Andalusia, in Cantabria, in different regions, couldn't or can't do it. I know the answer, or I can guess the answer, but I think it's very, very difficult to explain how Europe don't establish a minimum and homogeneous standards. And for instance, another example is why is the reason because in Spain, all consumers are obliged to use face masks outdoors, when in other countries of Europe is not mandatory. Thank you so much.
Well, you have put two questions, and if you allow me some sense of humor, I would gladly say, don't push me. I'm a professor of constitutional law. I'm appalled by the measures that have been adopted by a number of member states in contempt of their own constitutional dispensations. In Spain, many things have happened that I would have never dared to imagine when I have been teaching constitutional law for years. How can you explain that you cannot travel with your car from Alicante to Albacete because they happen to be in different regions in Spain? No explanation, no legal acceptable explanation whatsoever. Absolutely unacceptable. The only wonder is how have we put up with this? How did we put up with this? How did it happen? How could it be? How did we tolerate it? Because I'm sure you know that there has been a variety of legal claims before different courts of justice with a variety of jurisprudence on the matter, relevant decisions being made by different courts in contradiction to each other. Now, finally, the government has come up with a new piece of legislation, so-called law decree, which has endowed the Supreme Court of Spain with the competence of unifying that contradictory decisions being made by regional courts. So the situation is untenable. It has brought about legal uncertainty, personal uncertainty, and injustice on the way. A lot of heavy fines imposed on defenseless people that have been imposed by this policing of the measures that have been taken by local authorities, regional authorities, and of course, by the same token, by the national government itself. But the point is that we have to overcome this chaotic situation that may be explained on a factual basis on the grounds that this situation has been unprecedented in history. We had never seen anything like it. We had never imagined that a pandemic could somehow cause this effect, have this impact, and make us change the patterns, the behavioral patterns in so many ways. You have also made a legal point as to how is it possible that in some countries masks are obligatory, some countries not. Well, that is a decision that can be made by national authorities. I would say that the most puzzling thing is that there is no, so far, clear scientific indication that some measures have a correlation, a direct impact on the improving of the epidemiological sequencing, because you see that there are some Scandinavian countries in which masks have not been obligatory, with no indication that they have paid a death toll unbearable because the big mistake they made. No, there is no clear indication that that has been the case. But the point is that, yes, member states are, of course, allowed to take this kind of preventive measures, social distancing, masks, but in all, there have been undeniably undeniably a number of decisions being made in contempt of the constitutional dispensations of the member states, including restrictions from regional traveling. And of course, those contradictions that you have pointed out. How is it possible that someone can come all the way from Scotland and I cannot fly from Tenerife to Gran Canaria? What kind of a joke is this? How is it possible that someone can come from Rome to Gran Canaria and someone cannot go from Tenerife to El Hierro? That's absurd. That is preposterous. That is grotesque. Well, yes, it is. All of that it is. But it's happened. The only question is how did we put up with this? How did it happen? But it's happening. The point is that we should overcome it. The sooner the better. And for those contradictions to be overcome, it takes a European strategy. It takes a European way out. It takes a European approach to the light at the end of the tunnel, so that we can leave all these contradictions behind. The sooner the better, and overcome a situation which is for sure extremely puzzling, extremely disturbing, extremely subject to criticisms in so many ways.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, thank you for highlighting those paradoxes that I also had the chance to highlight last week, because I cannot leave the municipality where I live in the Basque Country, but I could fly to Amsterdam and then I could fly to Italy without any problem, but just paying a little tax, which is the test. This is visible. A final question on this, Mr. Lopez Aguilar, which I think is very fundamental, and I'm sure somebody's going to ask you at some point. The COVID certificates carry the potential to free up cross-border travel. Will they be used also for overcoming internal borders? So will my COVID certificate allow me to leave the Basque Country to go to Navarra or to go to Madrid? What kind of legality or what kind of expectations there might be in relation to that?
That should not happen. Precisely the purpose of the certificate is to prevent regional disparities, to consolidate. Precisely the point is to secure cross-border transits between the internal borders of the European Union in order to restore Schengen, a fully operational Schengen, to have Schengen back on track, to overcome this Schengen at stake kind of situation. But it shouldn't happen that the certificate should be applied for any other purpose, including internal purposes. We are trying to stick to the principle of purpose limitation to prevent that the certificate is requested for any other activity other than crossing borders. For instance, going to movies, going to the theater. But yes, it could well happen that regions that have announced that they should be somehow putting in place some regional certificate to enter the territory of that region, the so-called perimetral confinement, as it is put in Spain, could also be asking for it. Let's hope that it shall not happen. And let's hope that throughout the negotiating process, which I insist is very tight, very demanding, because time is of the essence, the commitment is to adopt it in plenary final June European Parliament, so that it could somehow do the trick over the summertime, come somehow to shed some light into the uncertainties of the summertime, so that it would prevent also regional authorities from trying to divert the application of this certificate to any other purposes other than crossing external borders between the member states of the Schengen area in the European Union.
Thank you so much for your time, for your clarity, and for championing citizenship right. Good luck with the next rounds of the negotiations. We feel that you need some luck and some support. I'm pretty sure that today you heard some support from us. Thank you to everybody, to all our panelists, to Professor Bialazevich, to Julie Frère, to Ileana Isperciano, and to Luis Araujo, the president of the European Travel Commission. Thank you to the Euroconsumers and to the Good Lobby for putting together such a webinar, and see you soon.